Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 329. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, September the 9th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Topic of today's essay: climate change is real. UFOs are real. Now you think to yourself, why is he picking a topic like that? Climate change has nothing to do with UFOs. Well, it does and it doesn't. And the reason I say that is because they're both real. Climate change is happening. The climate is changing. It's getting warmer. Storms seem to be getting worse. UFOs are definitely real. There's unidentified flying objects out there that nobody has the slightest idea as to what they are. However, the UFOs aren't necessarily little green men from someplace else. And climate change is not necessarily being caused because you drive an SUV. That's how we're going to compare the two. We're going to talk mainly about climate change, not so much about UFOs. And what's going on, what are the facts, what's true, what's not true, and what is just maybe hyperbole or maybe theory, not to be dismissed, but not to be treated as gospel, okay? So that's the topic of today's discussion. Climate change is real. UFOs are real. Same. Before we do that, I wanted to talk about a couple of things here. First of all, quick update on the Jaguar. Dad and I have been working on it every Saturday for a little bit. We're still working on... I think we may have almost finalized the fuel ports. Those are about done. Maybe a little bit of an adjustment here or there because the doors don't want to quite close correctly, and the locks aren't on the doors yet, but everything else is done, ready to put in the gas tank, which that's going to come soon. Still working on the trunk latches because when I took those things apart, bolts were broken. So because bolts were broken, they have to be drilled out and retapped. I have to do that before we can finish the installation. Today we're planning on working on putting the headlights in. And I've got the gaskets made up and we're ready to put the headlights in. So more what do I want to call it? Bling, Dad likes to put bling on the car. So that's what we've been concentrating on here lately because that's what he wants to do. Okay. So that's what's going on with the car. After the podcast, I'll be working on it with Dad once again. Before we get into the essay, I want to talk about one more thing. It's sports. Here in East Central Missouri, we're Cardinal fans. There's not much to cheer about this year because the team is dismal. But I've been saying this for years, and sports, like anything else in this world, are changing, and they're changing big time. And the main thing that's driving the change in sports, I believe, is money. I mean, once upon a time, I think in the last 10 years, I may have paid to see one or two baseball games. Now, I usually see one or two a year, but I get tickets from somebody, okay? Some benevolent party says, hey, I got tickets for the game. You want to go? Sure. What the heck? And they were usually bought by a corporation. But I don't pay for them. The corporation buys them, okay? But once upon a time, I would go to about 20 games a year and pay for it out of my pocket when I had a whole lot less money than now. Many of the times was when I was in high school. We used to go, me and my brothers and my sister and my friends, we'd go down to Busch Stadium several times a year. Mom would drive us down there, or somebody else would drive us down there, or we'd take the Redbird Express from the Northland Shopping Center parking lot and go down there because bleacher seats were $1. Okay, now good seats at Busch Stadium they're over $100, sometimes hundreds of dollars a piece. And that's because ball players don't make... In 1968, the Cardinals had the highest payroll in Major League Baseball. Their payroll for the entire 25-man roster was $1 million. Now, when you bring a player up from AAA, you pay him $700,000 a year. So they've got to charge more because they're paying their players more. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. But enter the case of Steven Strasburg. Steven Strasburg was, when he was drafted by the Washington Nationals, he was touted as the next best thing, the next Cy Young, the next Nolan Ryan, the next Tom Seaver, the next Bob Gibson, fill in the blank. And actually, he had a nice career. I guess maybe you could say he's having a nice career, but it was full of injuries. He was injured at least half the time. But he still made a lot of money. And earlier this year, they announced his retirement because he was injured again. They didn't think he'd come back from it. He still owed over $100 million by the Washington Nationals. And apparently they talked to him, said, look, if you retire, we'll just pay you. So, okay, we're going to retire you. Or I think the ceremony was supposed to be this weekend. The Nationals have rethought this. They thought, wait a minute, we're just going to pay this guy $100 million to go home? That's a lot of money. We're not going to do it. So now the Nationals are saying they're not saying anything. They're just saying they've postponed the retirement festivities because he's not retiring. So I don't know if that means they're going to make him show up and try to make a comeback, or they're going to try to renegotiate paying him something less than the $100 million, okay? And that's where baseball's changed. It's not so much that they're paying these players all this money to play. A lot of these teams out there are paying players a whole lot of money, and they're not even playing. I mean, sometime in July is called Bobby Bonilla Day because the New York Mets are still paying Bobby Bonilla $1 million a year on a contract, and will be, by the way, for the next, I think, 7-8 years, something like that. He renegotiated his contract. It's going to be we don't have to pay you the $10 million now, but we'll pay you $20 million for 20 years starting in the year 2005 or something like that. Something like that, because they took their money and invested it elsewhere because they could make a whole lot more money. And that elsewhere was with Bernie Madoff, and they didn't make any good money on that either. But the thing is I think the New York Mets have something like $100 million in payroll for players that aren't even playing. I want to say Oral Hershiser is still being paid by the New York Mets. Don't quote me on that. It's either him or somebody who played around the same time. Some guy who was popular in the 90s is still being paid by the New York Mets because he had a contract like this, okay? And that's the big problem. Not only are they paying the star players 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, $45 million a year, but these players are signing long-term contracts, like a $30 million a year contract for 10 years. Then after year 3, they get hurt. Now what do? Well, it's a contract. You got to pay it. They're starting to balk. Now, why is there so much money involved in sports? We talked about cable TV before. In fact, last week, I think we talked about cable TV. But it has to do with sports betting as well. In fact, sports betting continues to expand across the United States, setting up potentially record-breaking 2023 being the most wagered on sport in America is football, okay? Now, this is according to the American Gaming Association survey. 73.5 million adults plan to bet on an NFL game this season. Now, what's more, 37% of all NFL fans expect to place a bet on an NFL game this season. Now, I know football isn't baseball, but you get the picture. Sports are sports. In fact, the $73.5 million number comes from an online survey conducted by Morning Consult on behalf of the American Gaming Association between August 29th and 31st. Okay? Now, you think to yourself, wow, okay, that's a lot of people. 73.5 million people? How many do you think bet on football last year? According to a similar survey, 46 million people. It's almost double. Almost double. In fact, one major reason they say for the year-over-year increase is because more states are now allowing legal gambling. This year, 35 states allow it. Last year, only 31. Okay, so 4 more states allow gambling this year than last. But the number has close to doubled. 37% last year. I'm sorry, what's the number here? Let me find it real quick. 43 million last year, 73 million this year. That's a lot more than an extra 4 states. And think about it. That number is going to go higher when California votes to legalize gambling. California is the most populous state in the union. Where's this going? I don't know. But I will tell you that if you get a player who's making X amount of dollars, and when there's billions of dollars at stake, and somebody whispers in his ear, hey, just drop this pass. Just do this. Just do that. If you do all that, I'll give you a few $1,000,000. Someone's going to take it. In fact, if you watch that Monday Night Football game, the Lions between the Lions and the Kansas City Chiefs, Chiefs should have won that game, but they didn't. The Lions won the game because the main wide receiver for the Chiefs couldn't seem to catch a football. And everybody was scratching their head. Well, this is an easy catch to make. Why didn't he make these catches? Maybe he had a bad day. Maybe he's not as good as he thought he was. Maybe he threw the game. I'm not saying he threw the game. I'm just saying that's a possibility. And what's a reality is one day somebody is going to do it. Maybe it happened Monday. Maybe it didn't. But it's going to happen, my friends. Money is ruining sports. Okay, let's get on with today's essay. Climate change is real. UFOs are real. Fact, same, real. Now, the reason I say that is that's a true statement. Climate change is real. You can't deny it. It's getting hotter. It's getting warmer. Many places are getting drier. Things are changing, okay? Some places for the better, some places for the worse. There's an island in the South Pacific that it's getting ready to that you're going to abandon it because this island is like 1 foot above sea level, and they're expecting the ocean to raise something close to a foot. So that island's not going to be around. Okay, climate change is real. Now, who knows why? It's not necessarily because you drive an SUV. There could be other things going on. Okay, like UFOs are real. The Tic Tac UFOs, nobody knows what those are. The government admits, look, we don't know what they are. We have no idea what they are. They are UFOs. But just because the UFO is real doesn't mean it's a spaceship from Alpha Centauri, all right? That is what we don't know. Just because climate change is real does not necessarily mean it's man-made. It could be the sun-made. It could be that the way the cold fronts, the warm fronts are moving. Who knows? But it is getting warmer. Climate change is real. In fact, the city of Phoenix is on track to break its record for the most 110-degree days with 52 so far this year. 52 times this year it's been 110 degrees or more in Phoenix, Arizona. And I know Phoenix is the land of the sun. A lot of people like to retire there because it's nice and warm. But sorry, folks, 110 degrees is not nice and warm. I've been in 110 degrees weather. And by the way, in very low humidity, 110 degrees, and it is HOT. Now, CBS News senior weather and climate producer David Parkinson says that Phoenix has a shot at reaching 110 degrees today, too, Saturday. And Phoenix residents are expected to experience sweltering temperatures as high as 114 degrees this weekend. That's as hot as I've been in Death Valley. 114 was 114 or 116, something like that. And friends, it's hot. That sun hits you and you feel like you just opened the oven and stuck your face in. Okay. You cannot be out in that heat in the sun for very long, or there'll be problems. And Phoenix residents are expected to experience sweltering temperatures as high as 114 degrees this weekend. We already talked about that. Now, Phoenix, which the Associated Press calls the hottest large city in America, endured 31 consecutive days of 110 degrees or more in July, which marked the hottest month globally on record. Now, not only did the city suffer extreme heat under the summer sun, it also faced temperatures in the 90 at nighttime. In fact, they had a nighttime temperature of 97 degrees one time. Again, I've experienced that in Death Valley where people don't live, okay? If it's 90-something degrees at nighttime, you're not sleeping unless you have climate control, okay? Now, the scorching weather has impacted residents in Phoenix all summer, leading to more than 1,000 emergency call services in July alone. Everyone from the elderly to student athletes to the growing homeless population have had to make accommodations for the brutal heat. Now, the National Weather Service has issued an extreme heat warning for this weekend, advising residents to stay out of the sun from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and watch out for heat stress for people and for animals. Phoenix is in trouble, friends. They sit on a big aquifer that's being used up. And that's what happens when you put millions of people in the desert with no water, okay? And to make things worse, you've got to have controlled climate out there. And with climate change, all the climate change nut jobs who are saying, okay, well, we have to have everything being electric. No more natural gas, no more coal, no more fill in the blank. Everything's going to be electric. Well, how are we going to generate that electricity? Well, we're going to do it with sun and wind. Okay. It's not happening. You got to have your air conditioner on if it's 110 degrees, or if you're older, or even if you're not older, you could die. 110 is not uncomfortable. 110 is life-threatening. So climate change is a real thing. You can't deny that. And I did an essay a couple weeks ago about extremes and how people are taking things to the extreme. In fact, it was last weekend. We live in the age of the extremes. You're either on the climate change thing. You're either climate change is by the year 2026, everything under 1,000 feet above sea level is going to be underwater. And the other end is no, it's not getting warmer. In fact, facts show it's getting colder. I've had people tell me that. Well, the truth of the matter is the scientific studies say it's getting cooler. No, it's not. If you say things like it's not getting warmer, it's getting colder, or if you say things like everything under 1,000 feet above sea level is going to be underwater in 10 years, you're a dope. Because as usual, the truth lies somewhere in between. Now, is climate change something that's just brand new? No, actually, climate change has been going on for a long, long time. We're better at recording weather. We're better at looking at history. We're better at predicting the weather. And the weather affects us a lot. And maybe that's why it's more in the forefront of the news. I don't know. But how long has climate change been going on? Well, consider this. Greenland. Who lives in Greenland? Eskimos, okay? There's not many people who live in Greenland, but some. Norwegians inhabited Greenland beginning when? Around the year 1000. So for over 1,000 years ago, the Norwegians, Vikings, inhabited Greenland. And they stuck around for about 450 years, and then they left. Now, archaeologists propose that two main hypotheses is why the Norwegian settlers disappeared in Greenland. Either the entire population died, or the Norwegians just migrated back to the mainland of Europe. And actually, that's probably what happened. And they say that because of what they left behind, or what they didn't leave behind. They didn't leave behind jewelry, cups, candelabras, and other metal objects, okay? If they had all died, they'd be there. But the ruins just show none of that. In other words, they took their good stuff and left. Now, if the pioneers had sailed back to Europe, they'd have taken that stuff with them. So that's why they think that hypothesis is correct. But again, it's a theory. They don't know for sure. And if some of them left, a drop in the population would have been catastrophic to the small settlements that were left. In fact, at the peak, they estimate that no more than 2,500 people lived in Greenland, starting in the year 1000. Now, the Norse settlements in Greenland were facing several stresses shortly after they were abandoned in the middle 1500s, and the climate change was one of them. Settlers up in Greenland, they lived in a harsh, cold, and dry environment, and it was survivable, but just barely. So small changes in temperature, small changes in rain, or the sea level could have had a huge impact. Now, one of the reasons they stuck around so long is, remember the Black Death? in the 1300s. Well, of course, you don't remember them, but you read about it, okay? It never really hit Greenland, but it killed half of Norway's population. No one in Greenland, but half of Norway's population. So you think to yourself, well, why is that a big deal? Well, because Greenland heavily relied on Norway for imported goods, and this affected Greenland too. In fact, the main reason they went up there, ivory. No, there's no elephants in Greenland, but they're all walrus, and they went up there to hunt walrus because ivory back then was super popular. They liked to carve things out of it. And it was popular for icons and statues and jewelry, etc. And the Norse likely settled in Greenland to hunt walruses for the ivory tusks, which they sold back to Norway. Now, in the 14th century, ivory from walruses from Russia and African elephants became cheaper and easier to obtain. It flooded the market, causing the prices of Greenland ivory to fall, destabilizing a large part of the settler economy. So again, just like nowadays, why did people leave? Because they couldn't make money there anymore. Why do we want to go to this godforsaken place? To make money. Okay, it's harder to make money, time to leave. Now, the climate became exceptionally erratic and unstable, reaching both record highs and record low temperatures, becoming consistently colder after a while. A recent study also showed that drought conditions resulted in summers becoming increasingly dry. We think to yourself, well, summers are dry, who cares? The winters are what you're concerned about. No, the summers too, because farming was also a central part of the Norse identity, and the pioneers grew grain and raised livestock in addition to hunting walrus and seals. As the climate worsened, crop and meat production faltered. Colder temperatures meant that cows had to be kept inside for more months out of the year. As a result, they couldn't graze, and they had to have more hay to keep them fed. If you couldn't grow the hay because the summertime was drier and shorter, the cows died. The people can't make it. Settlers had to rely more heavily on what they caught from the ocean floor and the ocean period, and less on the farms. They know this because of the carbon and nitrogen isotopes found in bones in Norse graves. Terrestrial animals have different ratios of these isotopes than marine animals, and these ratios were passed on to the people who eat them. And the bones show that over time, the Norwegians in Greenland ate more marine protein and less terrestrial protein. Okay? Hunting at sea eventually became more challenging as well because the ships were lost, the men perished in stormier and icier seas. In other words, not only was it not economical, but it wasn't fun to live there. It's no fun if you go out and you die in the icy oceans. That's not fun. The stresses mounted as the weather worsened, and eventually they said, that's it, we're done, and they all left. Now, the changes in climate were part of the onset of what they called the Little Ice Age, and that was a period of widespread cooling and a drop in the average global temperatures around 1300, and that went on until about 1850. Now, natural fluctuations in atmospheric pressure, known as the North Atlantic Oscillation, may have also been responsible for bringing cold, dry air to Greenland at this time. So it got colder, and not just for a few years. I'm thinking about between 1300 and 1850. That's 550 years it got colder. Now, when did the Industrial Revolution start? 1830s, okay? Well, it didn't get warmer till the 1850s. The Industrial Revolution have been going along for a long, long time, okay? Is that what caused the global warming, the Industrial Revolution? I don't know. But climate alone wasn't the downfall of Greenland's pioneers. I mean, after all, they remained there for about 2 centuries after the climate started to cool. So it started getting cold around 1300. They stuck around until a little after 1500. However, a cooling climate was an additional obstacle they had to face. And again, it was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, the pioneer story is a warning to modern societies facing climate changes. The Norse were flexible, highly adaptable, and resilient to changes in their environment, and yet they still had to abandon their settlements. Now, what does that mean? Well, pre-Norse Northern Europe societies also had to deal with changing climate. In other words, Norway itself, while it wasn't as brutal as Greenland, it was still cold, okay? So they did so regularly by adapting their crop cultivation and livestock farming practices. Now, between the year 300 and 800 CE, they used to call it AD, Now they call it CE, the Christian era. Northern Europe experienced frequent cold spells driven by volcanic eruptions, which released gas and ash into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. In other words, the sun gets blocked out, it gets cooler. This period was known as the Dark Age Cold Period, okay? Now, the evidence for the cold spells comes from, again, calcium carbonate deposits in lake sediment cores and other scientific methods. So I can tell where the weather was based on that, okay? They didn't have AccuWeather back then. But communities either relied more on crops or more on livestock for food, depending on the climate conditions at a given time. In fact, during warmer phases, wheat, barley, and rye were staples of the diet. During colder phases, crops yield suffered, so people shifted to meat production. Okay, during the Viking Age, that was a period between 8 and 12 CE, when the Norse engaged in climate. It was warmer and more stable, so crop cultivation and livestock farming could take place at the same time. Why am I even talking about this? Because climate change is nothing new. The Earth has always experienced climate change. And it changes for various reasons. In fact, I read an article that was one of the most bizarre articles I ever read. And it had to do with the oceans warming. And the oceans are getting warmer. Again, that's a fact. Why are they getting warmer? They're trying to figure it out. One of the theories is because ocean travel, used to be powered, the boats used to be powered by coal or diesel. And they just were very polluting, okay? They've cleaned them up. One study shows that the ships that sail in the ocean now are 95% cleaner than before. And they think that they're so clean now compared to what they were before, is that they're so much cleaner that there's now not that layer over the ocean of pollution. And the sun is getting onto the ocean more than it used to, and it's causing them to get warmer. So the solution, let's try to find a way to put a haze over the oceans to keep them cooler. In other words, do we go back to coal-powered steamships? That would put a haze over the ocean. Okay, let's go back to coal-powered steamships so the oceans will stay warmer and then pollute the air more. That was bizarre. Now, what are we doing about climate change? There's some things you can do. There's some things you can't do. What did the Vikings do? They adapted. I think that's what you have to do, adapt. For instance, maybe 2 or 3 million people can't be living in Phoenix, Arizona. Maybe they need to move to where the weather is better. In fact, all these studies, have you read some of the studies on the best places to live in the U.S. and the best places to retire in the U.S.? Places in Indiana, Michigan, Montana, Idaho, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Maine. None of these are warm weather places. I thought when you got older, you wanted warm weather. I know I do. I hate the cold. Okay? But here's the thing. If you hate the cold, but where you are doesn't get as cold as it used to be, maybe you hate it less. And while I would love to retire to Miami Beach one day, I can't afford that. I can afford East Central Missouri just fine. So what's the old adage? Maybe the squeeze ain't worth the juice. Yeah, I'd like to live in Miami, but it's getting hotter. Yeah, I'd like to live in Phoenix, but it's getting hotter. And besides, it's hard to afford either of those places. I'll just live here, keep my money in my pocket, because the winters aren't quite so bad. I mean, they're growing coffee in Southern California now because it's warm enough. It's warmer in Southern California than it used to be. So they're growing coffee there. They're growing mangoes in Southern California. They're growing 2 crops a year now in places like Nebraska, where they could never grow 2 crops before. It wasn't warm enough. Now it is. So if you're a farmer in Nebraska and you can now put in 2 crops instead of 1, and for all intents and purposes, double your income, how is climate change a bad thing? It's not necessarily a bad thing. But here's where it gets insane, where it gets stupid. Okay, climate change is real, so climate change needs to be stopped now. What's the easiest way to stop it? outlaw ICE vehicles, ICE, internal combustion engines, and make everybody drive electric cars. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. Electric cars are the future. One day, I don't believe in my lifetime, but one day we're going to be driving electric cars. I mean, in the long run, once they figure out the whole battery and charging thing, they make sense. They're quieter. They're easier to put together. They're easier to maintain. There's less moving parts. Right now, the batteries are ungodly expensive. They blow up when it gets cold. Or not cold, but they blow up when they get wet. There's not enough charging stations. There's not enough electricity to power them. They'll figure all that out, okay? Kind of like when the ICE vehicles started back in the 19-teens, I guess, into the 1920s. Everybody just didn't abandon their horse and buggies. A lot of people still rode horses because it didn't make sense for a lot of people. There was no law passed that's, okay, you can no longer have a horse. You have to have a car. There was never a law like that. But many states are saying, you know what? Starting in the year 2020 something, in many places like California, was it 2029, 2028, something like that? No more ICE vehicles will be able to be sold. You can't buy a new one anymore. What? Now, here's the thing about electric cars. They'll be there one day. I believe that. But we're not there, friends. We're not even close. Because the electric vehicle revolution, it's coming to rental car counters, now ready or not. Now, there's plenty of travelers that fall into or not category. And quite frankly, I'm one of them. Some report picking up an EV that they're not properly charged, they lack accessories, or they come with little or no operating instructions. Charging availability is also an issue on the road and at hotels. The cars have fans who adore their designs and appreciate their energy efficiency. And if you really don't want an SUV, you can usually avoid one, at least for now, at the rental car counters. Still, some newbies are swearing off them after one rental or passing over them on a rental lot. I know I don't take them. One lady, her name was Anne Marie Angelo. She reserved an intermediate car from Budget on a one-way drive from Virginia Beach to Dulles Airport with her 79-year-old mother. This was back in January. The rental agency didn't have her car, so she was assigned a specialty Kia. Okay, great, I got an upgrade. The Kia Niro she got was an EV, electric vehicle, which no one at the counter mentioned. And despite getting charged overnight, the battery drained quickly. Well, because it was in January, it was cold. With at least 70 miles to go on the drive, the range flashed 30 miles left, so she had to hunt for a charging station so it didn't die on I-95. If you've ever driven on I-95, that's not easy. And it was cold weather. The first location, a gas station, listed on the crowdsource app that she had, it didn't have one. Budget Roadside Assistance, she called them. They said, look, we don't have mobile charging units. You're on your own. Finally, she found one at a car dealership, but it took a long time to charge. So they missed their flight to London the next day. That's why they were going to Dulles Airport. They missed their flight to London, had to pay for a hotel. Normally, I get to Dulles from my home on one tank of gas. I don't plan for random stops in weird places, which you have to do with an EV. Budget refunded her rental and gave her 2 days free rental for future use, but it didn't reimburse her for her expenses like the hotel and the changed ticket to London and the fact that her vacation was cut short by a day. Now, the Avis Budget Group and other car rental agencies acknowledge that a steep learning curve for these drivers in the early days of EV rentals are needed. But they don't tell them. They don't help them. They just say, here's your car. Have fun. Okay? Hertz plans on buying an extra 300,000 cars this year from Tesla, Polestar, and General Motors. Now, this isn't the only case. There's other cases too. Here's a guy, his name is Trey Johnson. He's a winery sales director from West Chicago, Illinois. He drives a 2011 Nissan Sentra. He booked a Tesla for a one-day February business trip to Louisville, Kentucky, instead of his usual mid-size sedan because it's cheaper at the last-minute rate. Save some money, get an electric car. Plus, he wanted to see what all the hype was about with these Teslas. He says he asked the Hertz agent about refueling rules and only got vague answers. He found operating the car a struggle. Just getting out of the garage felt like I was learning to drive all again, he said. He pulled over to watch a Hertz video on how to operate it, Finding a Tesla charger station on the way was easy, he said, but it took 20 minutes to charge the car before he returned it. 20 minutes. That's a whole lot longer than a gas station. Actually, 20 minutes, that's usually it's overnight, but these quick charging stations take 20 minutes. Now, there's a lot of Tesla evangelists out there. Once you get used to it, I think it's probably fun to drive, but I didn't want to get used to it. I was on a business trip. That's what he says. Another guy, Mark Nielsen, an infrastructure development consultant from Foster City, California, which is right next to Silicon Valley. Okay, so this guy's not some, dopey hod carrier. This is a high-tech guy. In fact, he's in the top tier of Hertz's loyalty program. When he landed in Chicago in May, he found several Ford Mustang EVs. He passed them up because he was driving to Cincinnati, logging hundreds of miles, and he didn't want the charging hassles. I mean, what, if you get 250 miles on a range, okay, that's fine. But what if you're driving 500 miles? I drive 1,000 miles on my trips sometimes. I'm not going to charge that thing 4 times. I got to find 4 charging stations and take minimum 20 minutes to charge it. Now, many hotels have charging stations. Many don't. Okay? Another case, it goes on and on. There's all kinds of cases where people just have troubles with their cars, okay? Nicholas Cicero, he's a part-time Uber driver in Philadelphia. He rented a Tesla from Hertz for a week this summer under the company's partnership program. It was cheaper than other rentals, and Uber pays more to ride in an EV for some stupid reason. The car was only 50% charged when he rented it. It didn't worry him initially, but the battery drained quickly than expected. On the second day of the rental, the car died on a busy street when he was half a mile from a charging station. Hertz sent a tow truck, but it couldn't get into the garage at the first charging station. 2 more stops were a bust. They drove 20 minutes outside the city to find a Tesla supercharging station. The 25-year-old hasn't rented an EV since. Retiree Mark Fromelt, who lives in Atlanta, rented a Tesla Model 3 at New York's LaGuardia Airport from Hertz in May to visit his mother-in-law on Long Island. They zipped down the Long Island Expressway in record time in the HOV lane without an issue. Their one issue wasn't the EV's fault, though. The Model 3 had a trunk in front, and Fromelt opened it to discover a previous user's Costco haul, including a 10-pound slab of meat emitting an overwhelming stench. And again, in the front of the car, so he had to smell this thing the whole way. Now, that's not the EV's fault, okay? That's the dope's fault who rented it before, and more importantly, it's the fault of the rental car company because they didn't clean it up. But there's all kinds of these problems with EVs, okay? Now, will they get them straightened out eventually? Sure. Here's my biggest problem with this whole EV thing. In fact, there's 2 of them. One of them, I think you know. One of them you may not have considered because for some reason, not many people are talking about it. And that's, I've mentioned this before. This is the big thing on my podcast. I read these news stories and I think to myself, this argument is obvious as the big nose on my face, but for some reason, nobody mentions it. Of course, charging stations. There's not enough charging stations. Okay, well, there are and there aren't. I would say probably 10 to 15% of the hotels that I stay at on my travels have charging stations, okay? Which means that 85 to 90% do not. And normally, they don't tell you they have a charging station at the hotel when you look at things. Or if they do, it's in the fine print. Okay? So charging stations are hard to find. But here's the thing. When you find them, when I see them, often, if there's like 7 charging stations, maybe 1 is being used. Maybe 2. Often, none. Now, they keep hearing, well, there's not enough charging stations. Well, nobody's using the ones that are there. They're not full, okay? They're just not. But here's the other thing. If everybody admits, you, me, the users, the automakers, look, we need more charging stations. So what are we doing? We're building them. We being the government. The government is building more charging stations. Well, the government has to build more charging stations because we need them. Here's a question that nobody asks. How many gas stations has the government built? I think the answer is 0. Why? Well, because why would the government build a gasoline station? Because the guy who builds the gasoline station is the guy who sells the gasoline. Why doesn't the guy who sells the electric charging build the EV stations? Here's the answer. Because if private business has to build these EV stations, and forget Tesla, because that's just part of the deal. But if private businesses, you and I decide to go into business and build a electric charging station and charge for it. Now the cost of charging your EV is about the same as gasoline. And that's one of the biggest reasons people buy EVs, because the operating cost is so small until you change out the batteries. But if the operating cost becomes about the same as an ICE car, then that's one more reason not to buy an EV. UFOs are real, friends. Climate change is real, friends. But climate change and UFOs are not necessarily what the extremists say they are. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's my email address. Send me an email. When I get it, I'll put you on the list. And upon publication of the podcast, I will send a link of that podcast to your email. You can download it and listen to it at your leisure. That's it. I'm done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.